Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the special post-election edition of the Carsey Policy Hour. My name is UC Terrell, and I work in the Carsey School's Center for Impact Finance. As folks are entering, please type your name and organization in the chat so we know who's here today. As always, your questions and comments are welcome throughout. They'll inform the lively discussion afterwards. I'll include as many as I can. We'll also follow up with recording and slides. Thanks as always to our partners at New Hampshire's Bureau of Education and Training. The BET's Certified Public Manager Program feeds into the Carsey School's master programs: Public Administration, Public Policy, Community Development, and Global Conflict and Human Security. The application deadline of December 15th is required for a spring semester start. So please go to our webpage if you are interested in furthering your education in those areas. We also thank our partners at the New Hampshire Municipal Association, which works to strengthen New Hampshire cities and towns and promotes effective municipal government through education, training, advocacy, and legal services. And we'll have a special announcement for you NHNMA network members at our next Carsey Policy Hour. It's hard to believe that just 1 week ago, many of us were waking up to the results of the presidential election, and of course, the full slate on the ballot, but especially the presidential election. Now you can't turn to a media outlet or a social media outlet without seeing some sort of post-election debriefs and analyses. Today, we're going to hear from Dante Scala and Ken Johnson, familiar to many of you as leaders at the intersection of politics, election trends, and demographic trends. Dante is a professor of political science at UNH and a faculty fellow at the Carsey School. And Ken is senior demographer at the Carsey School and a professor of sociology. They're well-published New Hampshire media outlets and nationally. Back in October 2020, Ken and Dante published a brief, Voting and Attitudes Along the Red, Rural, Blue, Urban Continuum, pointing out that voting patterns and political attitudes vary across the spectrum of urban and rural areas. I think sometimes the common misperception is that liberal, urban is one dichotomy, one piece, and rural red is conservative is the other, but rather this rural urban gradient is better represented by a continuum. And they've continued to do these analyses over the past years, including looking at changes in rural voting leading into the 2024 election. I'll turn it over to Dante now to tell you a bit more about rural America and the rural urban continuum and how it played out this year in battleground states and in New Hampshire.
So we're here today to talk about voting along the rural-urban continuum, and we're going to start with the wide view, looking at the entire country according to its place on the urban-rural continuum, which is a phrase we coined several years ago. And then we're going to do more of a focus on New Hampshire itself and how urban and rural plays out here at the state and local level.
So, as we've already heard, a common problem with the media and generally is an idea that rural and urban are really a dichotomy, that there's urban America and rural America. And we've found both in our research on politics and also in my demographic research that it's better to think of rural to urban more as a continuum than as just a single dichotomy between rural and urban. And so that's one of the points we want to try and make here. It's what we've tried to do in a lot of our research on political patterns in the United States. So these are the preliminary results from the 2024 election. You can see there are still white areas in some states where results have not been reported yet. And both Dante and I want to emphasize to you that we're talking to you about voting patterns with the data that's available now, which is still not complete and probably won't be for several more days. But we're giving you a picture of what we can see with the data that we now have available to us. Yeah. And you can see on this, sorry.
Yeah, this is always a bit of a conundrum for election observers. Everyone's looking for an interpretation of the results. And we have two sources, like in the immediate days after. One is exit polling, which is, you may have been asked to answer an exit poll on your way out of voting last week, but those tend to be rather unreliable in terms of accurate, precise estimates of what the voters are thinking. And then there's what Ken and I are trying to put together, which is county level results. And as Ken mentioned, sometimes these results are slow in coming, but at least we can compare how entire counties voted compared to, say, 4, 8, or 12 years ago.
Right, and there are about 3,140 American counties, and you can see them represented on this graphic, with the red representing the Republican majority votes, and as the red gets darker, we're seeing more and more of a Republican majority, and then the blues representing counties where there was a Democratic majority. And you can see that there's quite a bit of variability in the United States. Right up the middle through the Great Plains, you can see very strong Republican voting. On the coasts, things are more mixed. You can see, and we'll talk about this more, but in big urban areas, the Democratic vote is much more pronounced, whereas in the suburbs and particularly in many rural parts of the country, it's less so. But it's uneven. It varies across both urban and rural America. And again, one of our points is that there is a continuum of counties in the United States, ranging from large metropolitan core counties like Cook County or Los Angeles County, which are the centers of metropolitan areas of at least 1 million. In the case of those two states, or counties, almost 5 million or 6 million. And so this is a breakdown of the different kinds of counties that we'll be talking about, ranging from the largest metropolitan cores, which are the dark red, through their suburban counties, on into smaller metropolitan areas like Hillsborough County, where Manchester and Nashua are, and into then smaller metropolitan counties, suburban counties, and then on into the part of America that we're particularly interested in, which is non-metropolitan or rural America. And there are both rural areas that are near metropolitan areas, and there are non-metropolitan rural areas that are far removed from metropolitan areas. So although rural America represents about 46 million people and about 68% of the land area of the United States, it only represents about 14% of the voting in the United States. So the vast bulk of the voting, 85%, is in metropolitan areas. And you can see the breakdown of the vote in 2024 as we know it right now in the graphic on the left, with a substantial part of the vote coming from big urban areas and a significant part from smaller metropolitan areas, and then a modest share from rural America. But one of our points in our research has been that changes in rural voting can often make a big difference, especially in some battleground states. So here's our key graphic that shows the vote for the Democratic candidate across this rural-urban continuum, from the largest urban cores of 1 million or more, where Democrats have gotten a significant majority of the vote in each of the last 5 presidential elections. You can see then the suburban counties next to them, and then the continuum on out into the most remote rural areas on the far right-hand side of the slide. A couple of key points. Notice that in addition to having majorities, large majorities in metropolitan cores, the vote in the suburban areas is relatively close. So for example, in the 2008 and 2012 elections, President Obama did quite well in the suburban areas, getting over 50% of the vote in his 2008 election and nearly 50% in the other elections. If you look toward the rural end of the continuum, you'll see that the vote for Democratic candidates is less, and that it is certainly diminished from the 2 Obama elections into the more recent period. And then the key point that we want to talk about today is the difference between the blue bar, which is the 2020 election, which was run by President Biden, and the 2024 election, which was run by former President Trump. notice that there is a fall off in support for the Democratic candidate across the 8 categories of the continuum. The drop appears right now, at least with the data we have, to be greatest in the big urban core counties, where support for Biden was roughly 65% of the vote in 2020, but only about 61% of the vote for Harris in 2024. You can see similar sort of fall-offs across that rural-urban continuum, but that one is the most pronounced. You'll also notice that President Trump did better in rural areas in 2016 than he did in 2020 when he ran for re-election. And so our point is here that there is a continuum of counties and that voting follows that continuum, with the support for Democrats strongest in the largest urban areas and least in the smallest and most remote rural areas. Just to give you a visualization of rural America in this regard, this map has the gray areas are the metropolitan counties of the United States, and the red and blue areas are the non-metropolitan or rural parts of the United States. So here we've removed the metropolitan areas so that you can see what just rural America looks like. And as you'll note, there are a lot of counties that are red and pink, and not very many counties that are blue. So again, there's a variability within both urban and rural America, but rural America tends to vote more Republican, and urban America tends to vote more Democratic. That's held up through all the recent elections. Now, one of the things that we suggested is that Democrats don't have to win in rural America. They just have to do well enough that their advantage in urban America is sufficient to give them a majority vote. That happened in 2020. It didn't happen, as far as we can tell, in 2024. Dante, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, and of course, that was one of the thoughts behind Kamala Harris's choice of Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, to be her running mate. And one reason it was suspected that she picked him instead of a swing state governor like Josh Shapiro was that Walz hailed from, when he represented a district in Congress in Minnesota, from Minnesota, it was a rural district, and that Walz brought a rural perspective to the ticket to complement Harris, who hails from California, of course, and that would make something of a difference. But as Ken alluded, we really didn't see that in the final results, and that's not necessarily, putting on my political pundit hat for a minute, not necessarily to blame Walz for that. It's difficult for a vice president on the ticket to have a big impact. But it is interesting, Ken, how we saw that with rural, that there was some slippage, to be sure, from Biden to Harris, right? Harris did a little worse across all sorts of parts of the rural continuum. But the big surprise, I think, of the evening, at least as the data is emerging so far, is how poorly Harris did in those large metro areas that have long been considered this bedrock of Democratic strength. We entered thinking, well, if they can do a little bit better in rural, maybe they can carry some of these battleground states. But our assumption was going in that, well, Harris will at least hold her own in the large urban core counties. And as far as we can tell, that didn't turn out to be the case. And if you look at the results in states like, say, New Jersey, large metropolitan area, of course, deep blue state, the shocking results were how close New Jersey turned out to be in the presidential election. Harris won, but only by several percentage points.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dante, and one worth considering. As I said, in the big urban cores, Harris got 60.8% of the vote compared to Biden's 64.8% of the vote. In their suburbs, where Biden got almost 52% of the vote, Harris got about 49% of the vote. And the story is the same down the line. Overall, in the urban areas, Harris got about 50.8% of the vote in 2024 compared to Biden's 54% of the vote in 2020. Whereas in rural America, Harris got about 31% of the vote compared to Biden's 33% of the vote. So the slippage was much larger in the metropolitan areas than in the rural areas. We also looked more specifically at a set of battleground states, which included Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And you can see the rural-urban continuum for these states looks very much like the rural-urban continuum that we were looking at before. So the story here in the battleground states was very much like what it was in the country as a whole. You can see the slippage for Harris in the big urban cores, in the suburban areas of the big metro areas, in the smaller metro areas of the battleground states, and then in the rural areas as well. And so the patterns are fairly consistent, at least with the data that we have to work with now, looking along this rural-urban continuum, both in the battleground states and in the nation as a whole. Dante, anything else about the battleground states?
Yeah, I guess just notice really the global slippage of the Democratic vote share across all sorts of different counties, metropolitan and non-metropolitan, urban, suburban, and rural. So as political scientists are trying to grasp the meaning of the election, if you've been watching cable television the week after the elections, I'm sure you've heard all manner of different explanations for why Harris lost and why Trump won. But a lot of it points to, say, campaigns and different moments in the campaign and so forth. As a political scientist, I'm confident saying that a lot of that talk is overrated. What we're seeing, in the results is kind of a global outcome where the whole country seemed to move a couple of points more democratic, with some interesting wrinkles to be sure, but it indicates maybe this was really an election that was perhaps more of a referendum about the party in power, about the incumbent and so forth, just because it happened, all the slippage happened basically everywhere.
Right. So again, in fact, in the battleground states, the pattern was quite similar. Biden got 52.2% of the urban vote compared to Harris's 50.8%. And in the rural areas, of these battleground states, Biden had gotten 35% of the vote compared to Harris's 33.5%. So we're not talking about dramatic changes, but increasingly elections in America seem to be based on small shifts in parts of the voting population. And that's what we can see here across this entire rural-urban continuum.
And of course, Ken, that's, those results are, it looks like Donald Trump is headed to a very narrow victory with the popular vote. But note that the Electoral College tends to magnify the magnitude of victory. So a small margin in the popular vote can lead to what looks like a rather one-sided outcome in the Electoral College, essentially because all of the battleground states broke the same way.
Right.
So now we're going to shift to New Hampshire and take a close look at the results and then put them in the context of what's been happening in the state for the last quarter century or so. So Ken and I have worked with our colleague Andrew Smith over at the UNH Survey Center back over more than a decade, looking at how New Hampshire's voting population changes every 2-4 years. And we would do this basically in the run-up to every midterm or presidential election, just about. And so we would divide the population into 3 groups, and you can see that in the pie chart on the left. There are established voters, right? People who have lived here for decades. There are migrants, that's the orange slice of the pie. Those are people who recently moved into the state. And then there, of course, there are young voters who may have grown up in New Hampshire, but just got to the age where they can vote. It's dominated by established voters, the pie, but migrant voters, young voters, make up almost a quarter of the population. And then you can look why those migrants and young voters are important. Well, two reasons. One, we tend to think of New Hampshire as being, the stereotype is that we're rather closed to outsiders, but the demographic reality is something very different. And we often see that in our politicians, but certainly in the voting population, that a lot of people move in and out of the state, and a lot of people who live here actually hailed originally from somewhere else. And that has political consequences. Again, looking at the right-hand side of the slide, where these younger and migrant voters tend to have a different political profile than, say, established voters. Ken, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I just wanted to re-emphasize that point that you made about the changing structure of New Hampshire's population. Although there may not be much total change in New Hampshire's population, that's the result of a substantial amount of turnover in the population. In a 4-year period, more than 200,000 people will move to New Hampshire, and a little bit less than that will leave New Hampshire. During that same period, about 50,000 young voters will become old enough to vote, and roughly the same number of older voters will have died or migrated out of the state. So even though New Hampshire seems like a very stable state, it's actually one of the most mobile populations in the United States. Only about 6 states have more turnover in their population than New Hampshire does. So as Dante was pointing out, the voters who are here today aren't the same people necessarily who were here 4 years ago.
And you can see demographically, Ken, on why we hold our position as a swing state or a bellwether state, why the results last week turned out to be a bit of a split decision between voters favoring Democrats for some offices, Republicans for others. But you look at the bar chart, and you can see it's real. Neither side, neither the left nor the right, so to speak, has an overwhelming advantage. The biggest advantage is that young voters tend to lean to the left, but remember, they're a very small part of the electorate. You look at the big parts of the electorate, right? Migrant voters and, of course, established voters. You see that they're, left and right, so to speak, are basically even. And that leaves elections up to, say, those moderate voters who might be more willing to split their tickets, let's say, between a Democrat for president and a Republican for governor.
Next slide, Dante.
Yeah, please. So here is an overview of how New Hampshire has progressed really over the last 35 years in presidential elections. So we go from left to right all the way back to 1988. And I wanted to show you 88 because that was the last time that the Republican candidate for president in New Hampshire did far better in New Hampshire than he did nationally. Or to put it in terms of the Democrats, that's the last time that a Democratic presidential candidate did far worse in New Hampshire than he did nationally. And that was all the way back to George Herbert Walker Bush and Michael Dukakis. And so the blue line is how well the Democratic candidate's share of the vote in New Hampshire versus that share of the vote nationally. And notice what happens really pretty quickly in the 1990s is that those two bars even out, which means that a Democratic candidate for president was doing just about as well in New Hampshire as he did nationally. And that's true during the Clinton years, and then up through Al Gore versus George Bush. The two bars are very narrow. And then in 2004, John Kerry, right, Massachusetts senator, Democratic nominee for president, loses the national election and manages to flip just one state from red to blue. And that state is New Hampshire. And you'll notice that in 2004, New Hampshire, that's a bit of an inflection point where now a Democratic candidate for president begins to do better in New Hampshire than he or she does nationally. And that trend continues to the right of the circle, right, through the Obama years. Obama does well nationally, of course, wins 2 national elections, but does a little bit better in New Hampshire than he does nationally. 2016 looked like it might be another inflection point. Of course, that's the year of Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton carries New Hampshire, but quite narrowly. And she actually did a little bit worse here than she did in terms of her national share of the popular vote. But then things reverted back to what has become the status quo in New Hampshire in presidential elections, and indeed for federal office in general, including Congress, that the Democratic candidate for president, whether it was Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, did a little bit better here in New Hampshire than he or she did nationally. So we are still a swing state, but we are on, I would describe us as a second tier swing state in the sense that presidential campaigns, when they think about battleground states, they're more likely to think about Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin being truly up for grabs, whereas New Hampshire, because of its Democratic lean, is a state that these rival campaigns look to as a secondary target, so to speak. And in fact, in 2024, again, we're still waiting for the national popular vote to be totally counted, but it looks as if Kamala Harris probably will land around 48.5% of the vote. And she'll have done a couple of points better here in New Hampshire than she did nationally. Let's go to the next slide, Ken, unless you want to throw anything in.
No.
So if we look at the urban-rural split in New Hampshire, just in terms of percentages of the vote, in the lower right-hand corner, right, the southeastern portion of the state, that is what we would describe as New Hampshire's 3 urban counties. And that's Hillsborough County, which is the home of Manchester and Nashua, New Hampshire's 2 largest cities, Rockingham County on the seacoast, and then north of Rockingham, home of UNH, Stratford County. Those 3 counties, just by themselves, make up about 3 of every 5 voters in a presidential election. And the other 7 counties that we would refer to as rural New Hampshire, and that covers a vast for New Hampshire, a large area of territory from Cheshire County in the southwestern corner of the state bordering Vermont, all the way up to Coos County, way up north. And that represents, those rural voters make up 4 out of 10 voters in a presidential election. Next slide, Ken.
One point I was going to make here,
Sure.
This question of what's rural and what's urban is a very complicated issue, and there are many different definitions of rural and urban. We're using a county-based measure, partially because we need the political data as well as the demographic data. But understand that just because a county is classified as urban or rural or metropolitan or non-metropolitan doesn't mean that there are going to be more built-up areas or more rural areas in a given county. So again, this definition is one of many different ones, but it's the most widely used.
So one thing that's, again, you look at first glance at this graph, it's hardly spectacular, like 2 bars of roughly equal size, but it speaks to how unusual New Hampshire is especially in terms of its rural political vote. You don't need to be very familiar with demographics to know rural is red and urban is blue throughout the United States. But in New Hampshire, things work differently. And so here is the last two elections in terms of the Democratic presidential candidate's share of the two-party vote in New Hampshire. And so what you'll notice is that, in most states, most battleground states, one would expect the Democratic presidential candidate to run up big margins in urban counties and then basically hope to hold off the Republican candidate in more ex-urban or rural places in the state. But in New Hampshire, you'll note Democrats gain a little bit of an advantage in urban counties, but just barely above 50%. So you think about Hillsborough County, Rockingham County, Stratford County. A Democratic candidate, if he or she is on track to win the state, is hoping basically to hold her own, maybe do a little bit better than the Republican candidate in those three urban counties. But in rural New Hampshire, a Democrat can plan to do well, and well meaning a little bit above 50%. And notice sometimes that that rural bar is a little bit higher, just a bit if you squint at it, a little bit higher than the urban bar. And so rural New Hampshire has been a source of strength, of margins of victory for Democratic presidential candidates in recent elections. Ken, anything you want to add?
No, I was interested to see this. There certainly aren't many states that look like this based on our research.
Let's go to the next slide then. So this is the overhead view, courtesy of the New York Times, of counties and how they voted in New Hampshire. So each of the circles is a New Hampshire county. The blue circles, as you might have guessed, tells you whether Kamala Harris carried the county or whether Donald Trump carried the county. And then the size of the circle, you'll notice, varies. The size of the circle doesn't represent population. It represents the margin of victory in terms of raw vote totals in that particular county. And notice, again, it's this interesting mix of red and blue circles. Down in, let's talk about the urban first. You'll notice that in where you see the city of Manchester, that's Hillsborough County. That was a Democratic-leaning county that Kamala Harris carried. But then right adjoining it is Rockingham County, which has been a relatively fast-growing county in the last couple of decades in terms of population, but leaning a bit Republican. So Hillsborough and Rockingham have essentially canceled each other out to a considerable degree in recent elections. And then what leans urban New Hampshire into the Democratic column is Stratford County, home of the University of New Hampshire. So if you looked down at the municipal level, you would see the town of Durham, no surprise, leaning very heavily Democratic. But then you go outside of, into the orbit of Durham, so to speak, little towns like Lee and Madbury would lean quite strongly Democratic. But then you go into northern Stratford County, you hit more rural, it tends to balance it out a bit. In terms of rural New Hampshire, notice that large blue circle in the northwestern part of the state, that's Grafton County, which is home of Dartmouth College. And that is, Grafton County has become the most Democratic-leaning county in the state of New Hampshire. But then notice it's kind of rural as a mix of red circles and blue circles. You can see immediately to the right of Grafton County, in the middle of the state, is Belknap County. Historically, that's the Lakes region, historically very Republican, and it's remained so. The little circle right above it is Carroll County. Ken mentioned how there are different types of rural. Think about Carroll being more of a recreational rural county built around tourism and so forth. And notice how that's a bit more of a evenly split county in terms of rural versus Democrat versus Republican. Then there's Coos County way up north, which leans Republican. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And then Cheshire County in the lower left-hand corner, historically very Democratic, but notice not as much as it used to. And I'll say a little more about that on the next slide. Ken, anything you want to add?
No, I think it's striking that you can see the variability within rural counties in New Hampshire, as well as the variability within urban counties, which tells us part of the same story that we've seen nationally. But again, New Hampshire's a little different in that the rural and urban parts of the state voted roughly the same pattern.
So here, our last couple slides are going to talk about what we call the Trump effect in rural New Hampshire. And this kind of started in 2016 and has continued over the two subsequent elections when Trump was on the ticket. And what you'll notice, this goes all the way back. The blue bars show how Obama did in these 7 rural New Hampshire counties way back in 2012 when he faced Mitt Romney in the presidential election. And then the orange bars are how Harris did in 2024. And I want to call your attention to a couple of places in particular. The two middle ones, I think, are especially interesting. And notice that the drop off from Obama in 2012 to Harris in 2024 in Coos County in particular, but now also Cheshire County. Coos County, again, up north, a county was based on kind of natural resources and so forth. That was a place that Barack Obama carried easily back in 2012. And its reversal into a source of Republican strength during the Trump years is remarkable. I mean, counties don't normally turn on a dime, so to speak, the way that Coos did. But that speaks to Trump's appeal, I think, to working class voters across the country, but particularly in rural areas. And then notice in Cheshire County. Cheshire County, when I moved here 25 years ago, the conventional wisdom, which was true then, was that Cheshire was a huge source of Democratic strength, very strong Democratic lean. It still does lean Democratic, but not nearly as much as it used to. Now it's probably third on the list in terms of strong Democratic counties, behind Grafton and behind, well, actually, if you count Stratford as an urban, right, I would put Grafton, then Stratford as a source of strength, and then Cheshire comes in third now. And that, again, is partly due to this change in rural voters' political allegiance thanks to Trump. Anything you want to add, Ken?
No, I just was struck by the change in Coos County, which used to be, as I understand it, was a strong union county too, wasn't it? When the paper mills were all producing and there were lots of jobs in paper processing and related fields.
Yeah, it's really become like this kind of like archetype of, locally at least, in terms of being a Trump county and what we think of in terms of economic changes, counties being left behind and so forth.
Right. And there's a whole set of those kinds of counties scattered across rural America, which used to have manufacturing or processing of goods and now don't. So in a sense, I think it may be, as you suggest, representative of that kind of county.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. So here is the Trump effect in urban New Hampshire. It doesn't look nearly as dramatic, but keep in mind that, again, urban counties aren't very large in terms of population in New Hampshire, but they're certainly large relative to the rest of the state. So if these urban counties move just a little bit Democratic or Republican, it has big effects for statewide elections. And you'll notice, again, this is Obama back in 2012 versus Harris in 2024. And notice that Democrats have gained a bit in these counties, in Hillsborough County, Rockingham County. And the reason for that, I think, is largely because of the Trump effect has affected different types of voters in different ways. It's affected rural voters, moving them in the Republican direction, but for suburban voters in particular, places like Bedford, New Hampshire, and Merrimack, New Hampshire, and Hillsborough County, these are places, municipalities full of college-educated, well-off voters. And those voters have trended in a Democratic direction, at least for federal office, during the Trump years. And they've succeeded in moving Hillsborough and Rockingham County a little bit more in a Democratic direction. And that's offset Democratic losses in rural areas. Anything you want to add, Ken?
No.
Okay, let's move to the conclusions then. And why don't you walk us through this, Ken?
Okay, so just to summarize what we've seen here, we wanted to play up the point that rural-urban is a continuum, not a dichotomy, and that's true in these election results as well as other kinds of demographic results. The patterns in 2024 are similar to earlier periods, although Harris has done a little bit worse across the continuum. Democrats still do better in big urban cores, although not as well this time as before, and Republicans do better in rural areas. Harris received a smaller percent of the vote than Biden did along that entire continuum. We mentioned that in the big urban cores. The gap was that her losses were actually smaller in the rural areas, and the trends in the battleground states were very much like they were nationally. And then, as Dante's pointed out, the Granite State continued to lean Democratic, just as the nation has, at least in some parts of the nation. New Hampshire's rural-urban voting patterns are quite different from national trends, though, with Democrats receiving nearly equal proportions of the vote in rural and urban areas. So in some ways, New Hampshire is a little bit different than the national trends. In some other ways, it's consistent with them. I think probably we're ready for some questions, if anybody has any.
Oh, tons and tons of questions. Thank you so much, both of you, for this. I've been trying to gather my questions and those that are in the chat in a couple of different categories. One question is, the drops in Democratic voting for the last 3 elections have been really large. How much does race and gender drive voter preferences? Another question on socioeconomic white voters. And I bundle this by asking, in addition to race and gender, we hear analyses on education level, income, wealth. How do these factors that have been examined at a national level play out along the rural-urban continuum? Are there sort of different equations or different trends when you look at it through that lens?
Yes. So, Ken, you want me to start? And
No, yes, definitely. This is your world.
Sure. Okay. So, I mean, Ken and I started doing work on this on rural politics about 10 years ago, right before the advent of Trump. And when Trump won the 2016 election, thanks to his performance in rural counties and battleground states like Wisconsin, that spurred a large surge in scholarly interest. And one of the questions you see that we're trying to figure out is how much of this, rural realignment is really about race. And because we see, for example, we see these kind of urban-rural differences among white voters, but they're much less apparent, if at all, among voters of color. So that's one factor that, we see right away. Also, it's kind of difficult. We're trying to disentangle exactly how much, there's this phrase that has emerged in the scholarship known as rural resentment. And that's an idea that rural residents are resentful, not just of their economic condition, but in terms of how they feel government is treating them. They're not necessarily resentful of government having a role in their lives, but they feel as if government's neglecting them in favor of others. So, and usually those others, quote unquote, are people who live in urban settings, right? And so in Wisconsin, for example, right, rural residents would refer to government helping out people in Milwaukee uh, rather than in those rural counties. And so you can see right where I'm going, how this rural resentment can seem to be entangled with, okay, well, people of color tend to congregate in cities like Milwaukee as opposed to rural areas. So that's been one of the things that, our kind of colleagues in the field of rural politics, which again, has kind of burgeoned over the last decade, are trying to figure out exactly how much of a role, is this really about rural? Or when we look at attitudes, is it really more about race?
Fantastic. What about the other, gender, socioeconomic status? You're finding it most pronounced in race?
That socioeconomic, I think definitely we can see, Ken and I in some of our other work have looked at, different rural counties and what economies drive those different counties. And one thing we didn't talk much about was migration into these rural counties, which takes place more in terms of recreational counties and counties that are built around that retirement, right? And here in New Hampshire, for example, we can point to counties like Carroll, Grafton, where people look to retire and they bring their, one, retirees who can move tend to be better off than retirees who can't. Second, retirees um, who move don't tend to change their political identities when they're 60, 65, 70. And so that can help to explain why there's some differentiation along the rural urban continuum in terms of what economies drive those particular counties.
Yeah. We had a question. Can you tell if the shift towards the GOP vote signals the shift towards the values or policies of the GOP or away from those of the Democrats? And Dante, you touched on this a little bit, noting it was more perhaps a referendum of the, of the Biden administration than an election between two neutral belief systems. Towards that, we often hear of our political parties as this mishmash of social views as well as economic views. Any thoughts on if it is a referendum, is the social liberal conservative or economic liberal conservative aspect more pronounced here, particularly along the urban rural continuum?
So in the research Ken and I have done, what we try to do is marry, so to speak, the county level demographic results that we find with individual level results that we get from large academic surveys that are conducted. And in one of our pieces, or a couple of our pieces, when we look at that individual level survey research data, we see the continuum explains a lot, not just in terms of voting results, but also in terms of social and political attitudes on a variety of subjects, whether it's the role of government, whether it's on race and gender, whether it's on issues like abortion. And it's striking how the continuum really moves from liberal to conservative across a variety of dimensions, whether it's economic, social, and so forth. And it's always with this kind of inflection point in the small suburbs where, by that we mean the suburbs of those small urban cores that might be rapidly growing and filling out, but they still definitely have a rural character to them. I think with this past election, when I talk about a referendum, it may wind up being a lot simpler referendum than we think. And just in terms of you had a quite unpopular incumbent in Joe Biden. And when that's the case, and that has been true for a couple of years, Harris really found herself in a bind, so to speak, when she received the nomination at virtually the last minute. Because you can look around the world actually this year, and it's been true that parties in power have lost power, relatively speaking, in elections, not just in the United States, but across the world.
Yeah. Michelle asked about new voters. If a significant percentage of new voters or voters are engaged after years of not voting, do we have a way of telling if many of the lower socioeconomic white voters are newly engaged? And I'll note that as someone who doesn't follow election behavior that closely, I was surprised that highly engaged voters now lean towards Democrats, but less engaged voters now lean towards the GOP, where engagement is measured by who votes in the primary or off years, as well as past presidential elections. And so arguably this democratic value of increasing voter turnout was at odds with their self-interest this past year. Steve Marchand last week led a call looking at Tuesday elections, and some of the commenters on the call had actually registered new voters and shared anecdotes that in New Hampshire, both retirees and college students were registering disproportionately, or at least surprisingly swayed as Republicans, which is different than some of the charts that we showed, particularly among younger voters. So I wonder about this, this tension between the democratic value of increasing voter turnout and the observation that perhaps turnout among new or less engaged voters actually penalizes the Democratic Party.
Ken, do you want to start and just speak about like how we define new voters and migrants in the studies that we did?
Well, certainly, and this is not just true in New Hampshire, but in other areas as well, young adults are the most likely to migrate. And so you're getting a newer generation shifting, whether to, in most cases, away from rural counties and toward urban areas. And the flow into New Hampshire tends to be sort of middle-aged people with their children moving to New Hampshire. So I think part of what's mixed up in this whole story is the migration patterns that are occurring across rural and urban America as well.
Yeah, and I think in terms, I mean, I think that you put your finger on a big question that Democrats will have to face, and that is in terms, it may well be the case that we'll look back on this election as an inflection point in a couple of different ways. And one of them is upending the conventional wisdom, right, that Democrats benefit from high turnout elections, whereas Republicans benefit from low turnout elections. And that directly corresponds to an earlier point I mentioned, in New Hampshire, in terms of how the urban counties of New Hampshire have moved in a Democratic direction, whereas rural has moved a bit Republican. And that's because of those highly engaged, highly educated suburban voters. And you can kind of see the difference between how well Democrats did in New Hampshire 2 years ago in midterm elections, right? Where you tend to get more highly engaged voters versus a presidential election where you tend to get those voters who only show up once every 4 years. So I do think that's something that Democrats are going to think long and hard about. And that may affect their point of view on all sorts of things, including things like perhaps voter ID laws and so forth. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of inflection point that we want to keep an eye on is whether we're seeing, racial depolarization. Again, it's been a piece of conventional wisdom that people vote along racial lines, and that Black voters are steadfast Democrats, that the rise of the Latina population in New Hampshire, in the United States, would be to the Democrats' benefit over time. And again, the Trump era, so to speak, really throws some significant doubt on that conventional wisdom. And so again, we're still waiting for more data on that particular point, but it's worth keeping an eye on. And certainly there's anecdotal evidence, not just like in New Jersey, but also say on the, the southern border of Texas, where we see some at least anecdotal evidence of a move to the right among Hispanic voters.
We have so little time left, so I'll just say one of my questions, but then move on. So I'm curious, just empirically, how significant a candidate's geographically identity actually makes a difference. You think of Jimmy Carter, we looked at Jim Walz, like, does it actually make a difference? But I'm going to turn to a participant question, which is, analyzing at the county level seems somewhat crude in a state like New Hampshire, especially in a county like Rockingham, in which towns like Salem and Londonderry have little in common with places like Portsmouth and Exeter. Are there more nuanced ways of looking at these data rather than county?
Certainly, there are lots of ways that we can look at this data as it becomes more available at lower levels of geography. And I mean, just like we can talk about how there are political differences within a single county, we can talk about differences on a lot of different scales. There are many counties where you could, if you didn't know better, you'd think you were in a rural county when in fact it's part of an urban area. So anytime you have to classify things, whether it's states or counties or places, certainly you're going to lose detail as you talk at higher levels of geography. So there's no doubt that when you get into these data at the micro level, the story will be more complex and more comprehensive than we can do at this level.
Yeah. The audience member is right about Rockingham. It's a fascinating county where you've got the western half of the county along Route 101, acting, in terms of an ex-urban, rural, quite Republican area, until you get about halfway to, say, Exeter. And then Exeter out to the seacoast becomes a source of Democratic strength. And again, watching results come in on election night, you can definitely target, you can look at particular municipalities and see kind of which side of Rockingham County is going to triumph over the other. But a lot of times, again, these municipal differences kind of work out to a bit of a stalemate at the county level in terms of the final outcome.
Yeah, I was looking at the data for Maine, and you could, at the micro level, and you could certainly see the difference between the areas right along the coast, which is where many of the migrants that came either for retirement or for amenity migration, particularly during the COVID era, there were much more Democratic there. But if you get into the interior of the counties, it became much redder. I mean, that's just the story of America. All these, at any area of aggregation that you look at, there's detail that you've lost. And so I'm sure there'll be a lot more analysis done at a lot narrower level as more data are available.
And I'll say, you'll find it here with Dante and Ken's publications. Final question for you. The study of rural politics in the US, you've both been involved in it for a number of years, and it continues to evolve. I was struck by an audience member's comment. You might use the term other than migrant to avoid confusion, right? Some of these, the questions we ask, even the language we uses, can shift in like the public sphere, even as the academic lens can remain pure in that way. So looking ahead, where do you expect the study of rural politics to go based on and beyond these past election results?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point that that there's so much variability in all of this. And as Dante pointed out, we were amazed when we started doing this research. Rural political analysis was hardly of any interest, and then Trump won in 2016, and it dramatically changed. I mean, I think America's a complicated place. I think the migration patterns that are going on underscores the fact that the changes are coming. And much of what Dante and I were talking about was domestic migration. That is, people moving from one place to another within the United States. Immigration is a different story, both politically and the way that voting goes, and also the impact that immigrants have on different rural and urban communities. So I think this is just part of the ever-evolving story of how America is changing.
I think one thing politically is, again, even though, as Ken and I said, that a lot of the data is still out in the election, that's not preventing Democrats and Republicans right now taking their lessons from the election, and the conventional wisdom is solidifying as we speak. And I think one thing Democrats will have to think about is, they're in a bit of a catch-22, as more and more of their voter base becomes urban and suburban. There are certainly advantages to that in terms of having highly engaged voters. But the more they're identified with the cities and the suburbs, where does that leave them with rural America? And there are isolated examples of, say, members of Congress, Democrats, succeeding in rural places, but they're rare. And of course, a candidate's brand message, so to speak, often can correspond or conflict with the national party's message. So one thing Democrats will have to think about is what, if anything, can they do to bridge that gap between urban and rural to their political advantage? And I think that's something that we'll be watching over the years to come.
Thank you both so much. This is incredible. The PowerPoint and video will be up by the end of the week. I'd like to let folks know that our next Carsey Policy Hour is on December 11th. It focuses on greening affordable multifamily housing, in particular on the split incentive between landlords who would need to put the upfront capital costs to weatherize or to increase the energy efficiency in their buildings, and the tenants who often are the ones who foot the electricity bills. So fascinating conversation. We have Troy Moon, who's Sustainability Director for the City of Portland, and a second speaker to be named who is looking at how to work with landlords, owners, property managers to share some of the policy, logistical, and other ways forward to resolve this split incentive. This event is in partnership with the New England Municipal Sustainability Network, or the NEMS network. Thank you so much for joining. Following this call, there's a 2-question survey on what time of day works best for you, and what topics you'd like to hear for future Carsey Policy Hours. We will put those into action on January 8th, so weigh in now. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you next month.